Today's forum is sponsored by the Brown University Library and the Brown Alumni Association. 3 years ago, a reunion forum was held at the John Hay Library to commemorate the Vietnam Veterans Archive at Brown University. The archive recognizes the service of Brown alumni who served in Vietnam through the preservation of personal items such as photographs, correspondence, and memorabilia. Today's event is related to the earlier forum, but we hope to expand the discussion today by hearing from Brown alumni who had very different experiences with the war in Vietnam. I will now introduce our moderator, Joe Petteruti. Joe Petteruti is the president of the class of 1969 and has been a class officer since 1979. He is a lifelong resident of Providence. After graduation, Joe enlisted in the Rhode Island Air National Guard, where he spent 6 years as a weekend warrior. His goal in 1969 was to avoid the draft at all costs. In those days, National Guardsmen were rarely sent off to war in foreign countries. He is a veteran not of the Vietnam War, but of the Vietnam War era. Joe spent his entire career in commercial banking and real estate finance, starting in New York City. During the last 20 years of his career, he worked for Bank of America and its predecessor banks, Shawmut National Bank in Boston and Fleet National Bank in Providence. Joe has a partner, Pembroke Sidney Okashige, class of 1967, a son, Philip, class of 1997, Philip's wife, Michelle, class of 1997, and 2 grandchildren. Please welcome Joe.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for not only you, but the John Hay Library for affording our class the opportunity to present a forum on the Vietnam War. Today we're going to hear stories about classmates who faced the war head-on, classmates who protested that war, and classmates whose families suffered mightily as a result of the war. The war in Vietnam affected everyone differently. This forum will shed light on how Vietnam literally tore apart the Brown campus during the late 1960s. The dark shadows of war loomed large over this university and the country. It created dissension, chaos, protests. How did we cope with the war? What did we do to either support the war or protest against it? What is the ultimate legacy of the Vietnam War? Today, our panelists will discuss their own experiences and their own observations about that war. We're going to ask one veteran who's from the class of '66 to present a book, his naval anthology, to the John Hay Library. Then we will open the discussion to the full audience and ask them, how did the Vietnam War affect you? What were your observations? How did the Vietnam War forever change this country? What is the living legacy of the Vietnam War, and why does that war matter today? So our first panelist is Thelma Austin, who is a Pembroker who I met just recently this weekend, and she attained her MBA in marketing from Columbia University in 1971 and spent her corporate career in brand management in New York at Lever Brothers, Cheeseboro Ponds, and Clairol Bristol Myers. After returning to her hometown of Washington, D.C., to look after her aging parents, she discerned that every life is worth living about, is worth writing about, for the benefit of themselves, their families, and their future generations. Her passion led to the establishment of My Family Voices, a distribution publishing company dedicated to preserving the life stories of everyday people. Distribution of their books is limited to family, friends, and descendants, or as broadly as they desire. 2 of her brothers served in the Vietnam War. One ultimately died from his wounds, and the lives of her family, loving family, were forever altered. I'd like to introduce to you Thelma Austin.
Good afternoon. Yep, I'm a Pembroker, so I didn't go to Vietnam. But on the planning committee, when the guys were talking, they said, well, you Pembrokers wouldn't know anything about it. You weren't affected directly. And I said, my 2 brothers served over there. And one of you said, then you're going to be on the panel. Right. Well, war is hell, and particularly Vietnam. This is our family experience. I'll start with my parents, Mabel and George Austin Sr. My father was in the Army in World War II because he got drafted, but ultimately became a career soldier and also served in Korea. And he ultimately retired. There are 5 of us siblings: Shirley, my older sister, George, Melvin, myself, and my baby brother, Jerome. Now, George and Melvin are the 2 I'm going to talk about, the 2 in the middle. They are the ones who served in Vietnam. I want to say one thing otherwise about George. He was in the Army for 3 years, not sort of peacetime, didn't have to go abroad. And when he came out, he said, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to school or something. And the Army said, come on back in. We'll send you to school, GI Bill. So in October of 1965, our freshman year, my mother frantically called me and said, please come home right away. Your brother is going to Vietnam. And I thought, University of Saigon, right? They're talking education. Well, anyhow, just a little aside, hope I don't go over my 7 minutes, but I'd never flown before. So the first flight I took was out of Providence Airport. And when my roommate, Betsy Fitzgerald, and others figured out I hadn't flown, they gave me some pointers. They're so sweet. They said, okay, you know there are brakes under every seat. So when the pilot's coming down, you got to help him brake. Anyhow. So my classmates, schoolmates, all helped us to support George while he was in Vietnam. We weren't supporting the war, we were supporting the individual. And he was single, so we adopted him, and it was the George Andrew Austin Jr. fan club. We love you. So we were fortunate to be able to borrow a sheet from housekeeping and make this sign. And then several more came. Now, unfortunately, George carried this with him throughout Vietnam. You see the blood stains? Those were his. He got shot. The bullet went through here. It came out the back. Unfortunately, didn't hit any bones. So he lived several more years, but he was always in pain. They took out 55 feet of intestine. And there's the full group. We don't have all the names yet. Some are my class and some upperclassmen. We'd love to find out exactly who they are and get that done. But it was just wonderful support we got. And there is George. After Vietnam, he came back to the States and recuperated for a while, and then was sent to Germany. I guess they figured he was well enough. And I went in '69, the summer between college and grad school, to Africa, to Ghana on an exchange program. And on my way back, I stopped to see George in Germany. Well, oddly, when I told him I was coming to Germany, he stopped writing. And I couldn't figure out why. But I was going to get the State Department and Red Cross to find him because I didn't know where to land. But I landed in Frankfurt and went to the consulate, and they said, we can just call one number and we can find out where he is. So he was in a place called Aschaffenburg. And they called Aschaffenburg, and the guy on the phone said, oh yeah, Austin's sister, we're expecting her. Tell her to take the train on down. So thank goodness somebody knew I was coming to Germany. And when I got to Aschaffenburg, I got off the train, but the last 4 digits of the phone number weren't enough to make the phone call. So and it was odd that the German operator didn't know what those digits were. It's an army town, you know. But anyways, I had to take a taxi over to the MP station, and the MP took me over to George's barracks. And after all this time, with George not responding to me, they said, he's not here. Where is he? He's at the train station looking for you. So as we walked around the base, we found that people were coming up congratulating him on this great article. George, what article? Oh, nothing. George, what are they talking about? So anyway, it was a 2-page spread in the Overseas Weekly that was, and that's just half of it, the other half is down there, where he had won 3 court-martials. And 1 would be enough, but 3. And the reason is that George is a very professional soldier. He thought you should do it right. And when I met some of his fellow soldiers, I asked one of them, well, what do y'all do over here? And he said, well, our general orders are, in case of attack, retreat to the sea. No, shoot off all you've got and retreat to the sea. So they weren't doing much but being lax, and George would complain, and his commanding officer didn't like that, so he was thrown into stockade plenty of times. And after I left there, he was thrown in one more time. But he beat that one too. And one morning early, when I was getting over jet lag at my parents' house in D.C., my mother came running up the steps with this newspaper saying, "What do you know about this?" I said, "What?" Well, a neighbor's son was in Germany and sent it to her. So anyway, George was quite a feisty guy and very creative and fearless, so he went through all that. But that's a war he was fighting in Germany after going through Vietnam. And that's the other half of the thing. He got an award, recognition from President Obama in 2017. No, what's it? 11, I was going to say 11, for his bravery and his service to the country. And my other brother, Melvin, I promise it wouldn't take too long, he was in Vietnam later, a couple of years later, and he was a helicopter pilot. Now, he didn't want to go to Vietnam, but once he got into the Army, he said, "Let me go to as many schools as I can to avoid having to go to Vietnam." So he got into the Medic Corps. They said, "Yeah, good." Okay, but he had more time left in the Army. So he says, "I want to go to helicopter school." So he passed that test and got in. And they said, "Austin, when you come out of helicopter school, pilot, you will have only 3 months left. And we can't invest this in you. You have to sign up for another 3 years." So he did that. And when he got to Vietnam, we had a fan club for him too, because he was married, though. We called it we adopted his company, not just him. So, and he ultimately came back to the States. He went to Georgetown University Dental School. He became a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and he retired. So he's doing very well. But it was George who passed away in 1993 after 27 years of having been in pain. And if you go back to the picture right there, you probably couldn't tell because you don't know George, the second one on the left, but George was in pain. He had to be in pain all the time when you lose that much, and then you've seen all that devastation. And he talked about things like he was, like I said, he had some tall stories. He got shot at, but the bullet bounced off his buckle, okay? So that was one. Then another, I don't know how many of you are military, but in Vietnam there was a commander called Lonesome End. Anybody remember him? He was a West Point grad, and he called a strike on his own unit because they were infested with VC all around. And George was in that unit, but he'd gone off to another place to check on something, so when he came back, many of his comrades were gone. So war is hell, and our family went through it, and we haven't recovered yet. So thank you.
Our next panelist is Scott Summers. He is a managing partner of the executive search firm Windale Group in Los Angeles. He was a member of Naval ROTC, and I remember him when he was at Brown in his naval uniform walking around campus with Air Force ROTC, and everything at that time was in a state of turmoil. He is a veteran of the Vietnam War. Professionally, Scott worked as a consultant with the global consulting firm McKinsey & Company, and has for years worked in the executive search field as a partner with Korn Ferry and a co-founder and managing partner of the Windale Group. His community work has included being appointed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger to the California Citizens Compensation Commission. He also served as chair of the board of the Los Angeles Biomedical Research Institute at Harbor, UCLA. Scott.
You can tell that David's the experienced speaker here. He doesn't have any notes in front of him. I want to mention that we first started talking about this forum well over a year ago. And Jennifer was kind enough. The Hay Library historically has a forum that they try and involve the 50th reunion class in particular, some subject that was important to them. And there's no question that our class, the class of '69, and many other classes also, the class of '66 certainly, were deeply impacted. And as Thelma's story, as Thelma's comments indicated, it wasn't just the men who were affected, it was all the women who were involved with families that were affected, deeply affected. And in thinking about the forum, the thought was that yes, we all, or so many, some more than others, were affected, but it's also an experience that the country went through that we still live with today. And when we're done, we really want all of your comments on how you feel about that. When we graduated in '69, the country was full of turmoil, protests, and choices. Vietnam was all around us. In the 30 days between May 10th and June 8th, 1969, 1,592 Americans died in Vietnam, an average of 53 a day. Henry Kissinger. For those of you that were around, Henry Kissinger was the National Security Advisor. Actually, Richard Nixon has not really been in office very long, and ultimately Henry Kissinger, of course, became Secretary of State. But he was given an honorary degree at Brown at graduation in 1969. And so there was a significant movement to protest his receiving that honorary degree, essentially as a protest against the war. And I want to share one thing that George Lister, George, are you in the audience here? George Lister and I were co-captains of the track team, actually, at the time, but George went on to medical school and for a distinguished career at Yale. George and I were also elected. He was elected the first alumni president of the class in 1969, and I was elected the first alumni treasurer. And so IRA Magaziner organized, and this is a copy of the letter, all of the existing class officers, and they wanted all of the newly elected class officers to sign this protesting Henry Kissinger's. I frankly was reluctant to do it, and for a variety of reasons that are in some respects too complicated to get into here. But I was asked to go see Ira, and perhaps not surprisingly, Ira convinced me of the error of my ways. And so I signed it as well. I turned my back on Henry Kissinger, and 3 hours later, I was commissioned as I had been in Navy ROTC, if you can see that, and those two handsome gentlemen next to me are Jim Greenfield and Les Corwin, sitting right there in the front row. ROTC. We also, when we started thinking about this forum, the topic of ROTC. ROTC was a highly debated, very emotional topic in 1968, 1969, and arguments for and against it. We could spend 3 hours talking about what all of them, but I'd like to make a couple of comments. As I was actually involved as a spokesperson for ROTC on a couple of occasions, Brown had a Navy ROTC group and an Air Force ROTC group. Frankly, I did not start my career at Brown and ROTC, but as the war heated up substantially in '65 and '66, decisions had to be made. Join the military, protest, go to Canada, get a draft exemption, get a high draft number. Brown had a 2-year Navy ROTC program, and I got into that. So why did ROTC, copy of the headline from the Brown Daily Herald. It was all over the BDH during that period of time. And the CAM Club decides that's the Cimmerian Club, which was the predecessor. For those of us in our area, we know the CAM Club. The Cimmerian Club was essentially the predecessor to what is now the basically the student government organization. And as just a side note on that, by the way, in 1971, after we graduated, it was decided that the Cimmerian Club was no longer necessary because the students were all sitting on faculty committees, so it was disbanded in 1971 and later resurrected as. Any rate, so what were some of the arguments? The military arguments against ROTC. The military on campus was an extension of American military policy in support of the Vietnam War. Supporting ROTC was a vote to support the war. The war and the draft threatened Brown graduates. Academically, courses were offered in ROTC programs that were not taught by Brown professors and where the university did not have control over academic content. Arguments for ROTC. The country is better off if liberally educated college graduates are part of the military. 4-year ROTC members had their tuition fully paid for, which was good for the student and good for Brown financially. And my guess is those are mostly the same arguments that probably are out there today if people are talking about ROTC. Decisions had to be made. Brown made their decision to discontinue ROTC. The rest of us made ours. I was commissioned after spending a year and a half on a destroyer homeported in Japan. In January of 1971, I began training for the assignment as the Assistant Senior Advisor to River Interdiction Division 46 in Vietnam. By 1971, the Vietnamization process was in full swing. U.S. military units were turning over equipment to the Vietnamese military, and Americans were assigned as advisors. In order to more effectively insert troops and defend the rivers, the Navy developed boats that you see there that were more suitable for river warfare. The RIDS, River Interdiction Division, were the troop carriers and the tanks of the rivers. The River Division I joined in April of 1971 was in the most combat active area of the Mekong Delta, all the way in the southern tip of the country. The same rivers, by the way, that John Kerry very well describes in his book, Every Day is Extra, which was published just last year, and John spoke on campus this last fall. It's a very good book, and he spends an unusual amount of time about his experience in Vietnam, and frankly, ultimately, how that affected his coming back as a major high visibility protester after coming back from Vietnam. On May 5th, 3 weeks after joining the division, our boats were attacked. The boats were in a free fire zone. No one was supposed to be ashore along the canal, but the Viet Cong would fire 40-millimeter rockets at our boats, and we would fire 20-millimeter and 50 caliber machine guns at them. When our boats were attacked on May 5th, our only advisor on the patrol was wounded and medevac by helicopter. I was sent to the site by helicopter. This picture is almost precisely where I was today. The helicopter that I was on essentially dropped me off on one of our boats there that actually had a very small helicopter landing. And shortly after I got off the helicopter, I received a radio call from a second helicopter saying that they had seen a man running very near our location. The rules of engagement required the helicopter to get the ground commander's permission to open fire. I was the ground commander. I looked around that deck, blood all over the deck from wounded personnel. Nevertheless, one of the most difficult decisions that I had to make early on was, do I give that helicopter permission to open fire? And there was a lot going on there about the My Lai massacre and other sorts of things that, and ultimately, as those of you who have been in combat, you make decisions based on the best information you have in the split second you have to make it. I gave them permission to open fire, ultimately with unconfirmed results. I was with the River Division for 6 months. We had 6 boats out of 14 sunk or seriously damaged during that time. A number of South Vietnamese were killed or wounded. We had advisors wounded, none killed. In September of 1971, I was assigned as an advisor to a Navy radar program designed to detect North Vietnamese shipping. I was based in Nha Trang along the Central Coast and had responsibility for 4 radar sites and their advisors. This is to get a sense for what Vietnam is. We were in the boats, we were in the very southern part. Nha Trang, Cam Ranh Bay up on the Central Coast is where I was with this radar program. And I want to emphasize that the coast north and south of Nha Trang is spectacular. For those of you who've been to Vietnam, beautiful beaches, picture of me on the beach. Some of the most beautiful resorts in Asia are now in and around Nha Trang in Vietnam, if you ever have a chance to go there. After 6 more months working with the radar sites, I finished my year in Vietnam and was sent home. I was off to business school. I never personally experienced harassment as a returning veteran, but many did. My wife and I were back in Vietnam a few years ago. We were in both Nha Trang and Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. The country is lovely, green, and beautiful. The people are enormously friendly. Saigon, many still call it that, is bustling, congested, and vibrant. At one point in Saigon, I left our little group of tourists and walked by myself to the site of the former American embassy that so famously featured this picture in 1975 as the South Vietnamese regime was collapsing. The American consulate now is in that same location. I stood across the street from that consulate reflecting on the war, just staring at it. I could see this in my mind's eye. And 50 years later, actually it was probably 45 years later at that point in time, what goes through your mind is, why? What happened? How did this happen? For better or for worse? I mean, and then I want to mention why had so many Vietnamese died and what happened to so many of these Vietnamese that I worked with, got to know really well. What happened to them when the North Vietnamese ultimately conquered that country? Before I conclude, I want to recognize Ted Sinicki. Ted was my freshman year roommate. Ted was an Air Force pilot. He was shot down over Vietnam and was a POW for 1.5 years. Ted is back. He's healthy, lives in New Jersey. Unfortunately, for family reasons, Ted couldn't be here, but I wanted to make sure that we recognized Ted. At the risk of going a little too long in my don't want to steal your thunder, David. I wanted to, just 2 other things here, and forgive me if I go a little bit long. But Jeffrey Ward and Ken Burns wrote a book in 2017 titled The Vietnam War, based on the Ken Burns series that you probably have all seen. A summary from the book. America's involvement in Vietnam was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, American overconfidence, and Cold War miscalculation. And it was prolonged because it seemed easier to muddle through than to admit that it had been caused by tragic decisions made by 5 American presidents belonging to both political parties. Before the war was over, 58,000 Americans would be dead. At least 250,000 South Vietnamese troops died in the conflict as well. So did over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas. 2 million civilians, north and south, are thought to have perished, as well as tens of thousands more in the neighboring states of Laos and Cambodia. For many Vietnamese, it was a brutal civil war. For others, it was the bloody climactic chapter in a century-old struggle for independence. For those Americans who fought in it and for those who fought against it back home, as well as those who merely glimpsed it on the nightly news, the Vietnam War was a decade of agony, the most divisive period since the Civil War. Vietnam seemed to call everything into question, the value of honor and gallantry, the qualities of cruelty and mercy, the candor of the American government and what it means to be a patriot. And those who lived through it have never been able to erase its memory, have never stopped arguing about what really happened, who was to blame, why everything went so badly wrong, and whether it had all been worth it. James Wright, history professor and former president of Dartmouth, wrote a book in 2017 Enduring Vietnam, which is a fascinating book on what happened, particularly in our generation. Vietnam was a war that we had to endure, and at the same time, the effects of Vietnam endure to this day. I highly recommend it. Rufus Phillips, a former American Foreign Service officer with extensive experience in Vietnam from the 1950s onward, wrote a book in 2008 called Why Vietnam Matters. Again, what he describes as an eyewitness particularly alludes to what our military can and cannot do in other people's countries. I recommend it also as a very good book. A final comment. We lost that war for a number of reasons, but I believe two reasons were particularly important. The cause was clearer in the North, and the leadership was better. The North had Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, and the South didn't. Leadership matters.
Thank you, Scott. That was unbelievable. Our last panelist is David I. Kertzer, the Dupee University Professor of Social Science at Brown, where he is also Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies. Among his books are The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, finalist for the National Book Award in 1997 and published in 18 languages. The Pope and Mussolini, winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Biography. His most recent book, The Pope Who Would Be King, published last year, looks at the revolution that drove the Pope from Rome in 1848. David was an anti-war activist during his days here at Brown and among the leaders of the Campus Action Council. David.
Well, thank you. It is hard to follow that very moving presentation we heard from Scott. And what in my limited time, my task, I think, is to recall what the climate was like on campus, primarily during the Vietnam War, during our part of the Vietnam War, which really was at its height in the late 60s, and then very few reflections on maybe its enduring lessons for many of us, including those of us who didn't serve in Vietnam. The thing that students today, since I've been actually a faculty member now at Brown, I came back after 23 years after graduation, and of course followed student protests since our time at Brown. But there's a big difference between student protests when we were students and subsequent, including today, namely the draft. The draft had a way of powerfully focusing, I think, everybody's attention, and at least the male students were all potentially facing on graduation, being drafted and being sent to Vietnam. So this is a drama that really we don't find among students today. There we are. If I try to recall what it was like back then, and Scott made some references to this, there was not just the draft, but there were these images that we were seeing on television and in the newspapers and so on at the time. Scott mentioned the My Lai massacre. You see a scene from that on the right, where during our junior year, over 500 civilians were murdered as in the Vietnam War. You see some of the protests in the middle, another dramatic image that many of you will remember on the left. So there were images that were powerfully affecting our view of the world at the time. The other, as I mentioned, just to give you an idea, Scott gave some statistics too, but the US troop levels were going up dramatically while we were in the late 60s, while we were students. And with those dramatic increases in the troop level, there was also a dramatic increase in the fatalities of the US. I haven't gotten here into fatalities of the Vietnamese, which were, of course, even much higher. So the fact is, as Scott mentioned, you had hundreds of American troops being killed every week in Vietnam at during our time as students here. So this is all the background to the protest movement. The protest movement really grew out, from my perspective, of traditions of protests that really, for most of us through high school, were focused largely on civil rights kinds of issues. And I could see over, having entered Brown in '65, over the first year and a half, as the war heated up, a kind of transition from a focus on civil rights issues to a focus on Vietnam, although civil rights, of course, continued to be a factor. This was also a time of a great ferment on a number of levels. Certainly, as we come back for our 50th reunion, there's probably nothing more dramatic than the change in Pembroke at the time in students' lives, beginning where women, as we were freshmen, had to be, in their dorms by 11 o'clock or 10 or 11, and wear white gloves and have sherry hours and posture pictures when they reported. It was really a dramatic time for women's rights and feminist issues and so forth, civil rights. So this was all part, I think, of the same matrix for our experience on campus. I think by the time of my sophomore year, we formed this organization called the Campus Action Council that was very important for a number of us who were involved in the anti-war protests. There had been some debate on campus there was a national organization, many of you will recall, the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and there were debates I remember having on campus in our sophomore year whether we should form an SDS chapter, and that should be the vehicle of anti-war activity on campus. And it was decided, no, we didn't want to be tied, although there were a number of individual members, national members of SDS, but we didn't, as an organization, want to be tied to decisions that got made by others. And that, in retrospect, turned out to be very intelligent decision. So what did this movement do? Well, it began to organize anti-draft. So this is now in our spring of our sophomore year. Hell no, we prepared a letter, and a number of people signed it, that if drafted, they would refuse to serve in the war, and talked about, on the one hand, there was a conscientious objector, or kind of pacifist movement, but this was really, yes, there are wars that are justified, but the Vietnam War was not a justifiable war, therefore we would not serve. This was the position that we took. Scott mentioned, of course, the ROTC issue, which came to be an important one in the anti-war movement. And this, too, by the fall of '67, had become focused on trying to eliminate ROTC from Brown. This, of course, was very controversial, and there are various elements of this. Certainly, at the time, the students who were involved in this were largely motivated by anti-war fervor, anti-Vietnam War fervor. Curiously, the arguments that ended up having the big impact on the faculty and leading to the vote that would end up eliminating ROTC for many years from Brown didn't focus directly on the war, but on the fact that the military required that to have a ROTC program, you had to follow a certain structure. That structure involved, at least at the time, having a military sciences department that was basically run by the military, where the faculty were chosen by the military, not by Brown faculty, and so forth. I'll get back to that in a moment. Just again to give you a notion of what was like on the campus at the time. On the one hand, there were a number of protest marches and activities downtown, anti-war activities when Hubert Humphrey came, for example. But also we participated in various national activities. The first one that I remember was in this spring of our sophomore year. There was a big anti-war demonstration in New York, and for anyone who's been involved in a demonstration like this with hundreds of thousands of people, there's something that can be exhilarating, but certainly gave us a sense of being part of something much larger than what was going on in our own campus community. Then in this demonstration that became quite well known, the March on the Pentagon, in October 2017, a number of us trained for civil disobedience. There were busloads of Brown students who went down and participated in the march. There was a more limited number of us who participated in a sit-in in the blocking the access roads to the Pentagon. And as a result, this gives you an idea of a couple of the shots and some of the people involved there. Sorry that it's hard for some people to see this. Shows Noam Chomsky, Norman Mailer, Benjamin Spock, other kind of luminaries who were helping leading this demonstration. And those of us who were participating in the civil disobedience there at the Pentagon, blocking the road, got arrested. And so one of the ironies of my time at Brown is I never spent such time with such distinguished company as I did in jail that night. I say jail, there were so many people arrested that they basically had converted a military barracks to this purpose. But in the room that I was in with another Brown student, Bob Cohn, we found ourselves talking with Norman Mailer, who later wrote a book. I was very nervous when I heard his book was coming out, thinking he might refer to this in a less than stellar way, but we mentioned that we thought we were missing a midterm exam that was going to be taking place on the Monday in an American literature course we were taking. And it happened one of the books on the exam was The Naked and the Dead. So when we told him this, he asked us, "Oh, who's your, who teaches the course?" We said R.V. Cassill, whose name unfortunately I misspelled there, but and turns out he knew him. He was a friend. Cassill was a fairly long-time faculty member here in literature and kind of writer's writer. And so he said, I'll write a note. And so he wrote this note, which hopefully you can read something like, "Dear RV, please excuse Bob and David from school. Wish you was here. Love, Uncle Norm." I think that's what it says, something like that. Someone presented us with this recently. I lost my copy, but there it is. Well, this was a busy time for student protest. The CIA was coming just a couple weeks later after this demonstration at the Pentagon, and for the recruiter, it was part of other kinds of businesses and come to recruit. Well, similarly, CIA came to recruit, and the Campus Action Group planned a protest, a peaceful protest, but one that was going to block the access, block in the sense of the building in which the interviews were to take place had a kind of ante-room, and we sat down so that if the recruiter wanted to actually get to the room, or the potential recruits, they would have to step over us to get in. The dean, knowing that this was going to happen, accompanied the CIA recruiter and asked us politely to get up and leave, and when we didn't, took all our names, and so they began a disciplinary procedure against us. And so one of the things is I think back to this, just as those, of course, who served in Vietnam must think of, if they survived, their luck and the contingencies of colleagues who never made it. And this certainly isn't a life and death matter, but still the subsequent disciplinary hearing ended up with a 4-3 vote on whether we should be ejected from school. And it turned out the 4 were against the ejection and 3 were 3 in favor. So I do occasionally think, what would have happened if one person had changed vote and I'd been kicked out as a junior from Brown, along with some of my fellow students. Well, the summer after my junior year, just to give you an example of how this experience also affected our academic work, aside from being seemingly wondering how we got any academic work done at all, I decided for my honors thesis, which was in anthropology, that I would study the community of deserters, American deserters, and depending how you define them, draft dodgers or draft resistors who were in Toronto, Canada. And so I spent a summer, then I spent the Christmas vacation the same year living spent a month or 2 in the basement of a church in downtown Toronto that had been set up as a kind of hostel for American deserters. And I learned a lot in that study. One of the, don't have time to go into this, but being in this building, I can't resist mentioning that honors thesis is the only one that I know of, and now having been a faculty member here a long time, that got consigned to a vault and locked up for 5 years that nobody could see. And actually, that has lessons to when I talk to my anthropology graduate students about doing field work in politically sensitive areas, that you can end up with results that might be politically compromising. But if there's time, we could discuss that at some point. But back to ROTC, we ended up, the president, as a result of pressure, decided to appoint a committee to look into the ROTC question as a result of these protests. He thought, I'm sure he had stacked the deck by choosing as the chair of the committee a faculty member, Lyman Kirkpatrick, who had recently been appointed. He was a kind of a lifelong CIA person. He was actually the executive director of the CIA when he became professor at Brown Political Science in 1965. So he was appointed to head this committee on what to do about ROTC, but the student government that we heard about, the Cimmerian Club, got to choose, I think, 2 members, and they asked me and another student to be on this committee. Quickly recap, when the majority report came out, of course, it was in favor of retaining ROTC, but the minority report, which I wrote, and I think the other students signed on to as well, called for denying academic credit to ROTC courses. And on the grounds, not on the anti-war grounds, which for one thing we didn't think were going to carry the day, but on the grounds that the Brown faculty should be controlling its own 4-credit courses. This is another one of the sort of strange twists of fate. I got to, in our last semester at Brown, to present the minority report to a faculty meeting, which was then held at Carmichael. And I assumed this would be the last faculty meeting at Brown I would ever get to address. Of course, many years later when I became provost and had students with blasting bullhorns right outside my office at University Hall, some of these thoughts came back to me. But somewhat unexpectedly, the faculty voted in favor of our report and against the majority report of the ROTC committee. It still looked like it might be possible for ROTC to continue, but for ROTC to continue, they would have not been able to had the same arrangement of creating their own department at Brown and having 4-credit courses taught by their own military faculty. And so since that went against military regulations that structured these programs, ROTC left. Well, what lessons can we draw from this? And I'm aware of the time here, and we're eager to get on to the program and give other people a chance to speak. I do believe we have time here for those of you who can stay on for more informal conversation past 4:30, that we have the room available to continue the discussion more informally then. But just a word. One thing I haven't mentioned, but certainly affected our time at Brown, was music, and of course the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all that. But when I talk about the tradition of anti-war protests and civil rights movement, we grew up, many of us in high school, with We Shall Overcome and the Hootenanny and all this as part of a kind of protest fabric where music was so important. And similarly, at time of Brown, we actually brought Pete Seeger to Alumnae Hall while we were juniors for a fundraiser for the anti-war activities. And these are the songs that you see here that come to mind. Pete Seeger's Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. And as I think about the number of years that US troops have been in Afghanistan, it's hard not to think of that song. To think of Phil Oak's song, We're the Cops of the World, Boys, We're the Cops of the World. And I think Scott alluded to this idea of Americans somehow going into totally foreign countries, knowing almost nothing about the culture and history, and thinking that they're going to remake it in their own image. So that the issues that were raised in Vietnam are certainly, I think, on the minds of all of us who have lived through that experience, whether we lived through it actually being in combat in Vietnam or having participated in the anti-war movement while we've been here, or in some cases, of course, such as Organization of Vietnam Vets Against the War, having done both. Thank you.
Who knew? Who knew about this professor and provost? He had a very interesting life at Brown. This is the part of the program where we recognize a classmate from the class of 1966 who has written a book which is an anthology of his naval career. He will speak today of the personal losses that he suffered during the Vietnam War and then present his book, Whatever Happened to B Company, to Jennifer. I'm going to give you a brief overview of who Bob DeLuca is from the class of '66. He attended Brown on an ROTC scholarship and took the U.S. Marine Corps option. He was commissioned at commencement. Bob served in Westpac and left the service in 1970 with the rank of captain. He joined Mellon Bank in Pittsburgh and earned his MBA from the University of Pittsburgh. Bob relocated to Texas in 1970 and worked for Citibank before he became a real estate developer. Bob is an author of 4 published books. He's going to present one of them today to Jennifer Betts on behalf of 2 of his comrades. And I welcome Bob DeLuca to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And let me say it first, thank the class of '69 for giving us this opportunity. This is a program that we've started to honor some of the fallen Marines that we had in our class. And we've been giving these books to the alma maters of each school. And I think we have Harvard left to go. We've done all the other ones. Joe told me to be inspiring, and then he gave me 4 minutes to do it. I don't think I could do it in 4 days. I walked on the Brown campus in the fall of 1962 as an incoming freshman, and I made lifetime friendships during those first few days. The 2 that stand out the most were a pair of New Yorkers, Jerry Zimmer and Charlie Piggott, who were also Navy ROTC students. And I hadn't been back for a while, but it was almost like yesterday that Jerry Zimmer, Charlie Piggott, and I were standing out at Alder Dexter Field on a hot September Saturday, and we heard an Angelus, we heard bells ringing. And we couldn't figure it out, we knew. It was a Cary Tower. Well, Brown had gone 0 for the previous season, and I think Brown beat Colgate 7-2 that day. So things were changing on the Brown campus. Boy, were they changing. Jerry Zimmer was fresh off a Binghamton dairy farm. He was bright, reserved, and hardworking. Charlie Piggott went to high school in Williamsville, New York, near Buffalo. Charlie was loud, brash, never met a stranger. You might not notice Jerry in a room for a while, but Charlie was always at the epicenter. We were good friends during our 4 years on the Hill, studying, playing sports, partying, matriculating through NROTC, including summer cruises. In fact, one was on the USS Wasp, which was the precursor to the Viking Cruise Line, I think. While I was never sure what I wanted to do after graduation, Charlie and Jerry's goals were crystal clear from the very start. They wanted to be Marines and they wanted to fly. Jerry even earned his private pilot's license while at Brown. Charlie became the president of his fraternity and student head of the entire Brown Midshipman Corps. When they traded the USN commitments for the Marine Corps, they convinced me to join them. On 6/6/66, we graduated and were off to basic school in Quantico. By the way, Charlie married a classmate, Carol Crockett, and Jerry married a lady from Bryant, Elaine Zimmer. Elaine Zimmer was her married name. I had to be different, and I found Joyce in Pittsburgh. I was never to see them again after basic school in November 1966. They headed off for flight school at Pensacola and other training commands, where they excelled and earned their wings as F-4B Phantom jet pilots reserved only for the best. I had gone to Vietnam and returned before either of them left the States. Then in May 1969, Charlie was on his second flight, his second hop, an orientation flight, after joining Jerry's squadron in Da Nang when he perished in a mid-air collision with a tanker. But for a few more inches, a few more feet, he might be standing here with us today. I was honored to serve as his military escort with full honors at Arlington Cemetery. Everyone was devastated, but we still had Jerry. Well, 3 months later, more grim news arrived. While providing close air support to a Marine recon platoon, Jerry's plane was hit by ground fire. His remains have never been recovered from the crash site, despite Herculean efforts by his wife Elaine, who's been over to Vietnam several times, and they found parts of the plane, but never have been able to recover Jerry's body. I have no interest in debating the morality of the war effort. I am absolutely certain, however, that both gallant men were acutely aware of the enormous risks they willingly took daily. At least when they moved to be closer to their God, they were lucky enough to be pursuing their lifelong dreams. Not many people can say that. A group of our basic school class has put together this booklet, which is Whatever Happened to B Company. It sets out the glimpses in the lives of all the 180 of us who went to war back in 1966. The profound effect it had upon all of us is apparent. So I'd like to ask two of my Marine, Bob Lang and Andy Vart, to present the books actually to Jennifer.
Where do you want this? How do you want to do this? On each side? Or?
Yeah, you could do it like that.
Put Jennifer in the middle, right? Rose and Thorn, right? That's right.
Thank you.
We have now come to the end of our official program. What we thought we were going to have a lot of time for question and answer, we may not have that much time. I know some of you have to go on to other events. I myself have to go to a 5 o'clock memorial service, which is about it's the Pembroke field. But before I open to Q&A, and I know some of you can stay, some of you can go, I just want to recognize we have one of our class of 69 celebrities in the audience. I want Byron Lichtenberg to stand and be recognized. I am not going to read another biography. I just want to tell you that not only was Byron a U.S. Air Force combat veteran of the Vietnam War, but he is also a specialist, NASA Space Shuttle program, payload specialist, and he flew 2 missions on the Space Shuttle. He's a fascinating guy to talk to. I'm going to just ask him to open up this particular part of our program with just some general recollection of what it was like for Byron Lichtenberg in Vietnam.
Well, thank you, Joe. Yeah, I just want to share just a few vignettes of personal side from those of us who were in the war, kind of reflecting back on what Scott said too, that I had to make a decision. And my decision was I wanted to be an astronaut. My dad was a military officer in World War II. I knew I wanted to serve my country. And I knew that astronauts were all military fighter pilots. So there were kind of 2 motivations for me to join the military and go in ROTC here at Brown. And one was selfish, to try to become an astronaut, and the other was altruistic, to try to serve my country. So I did 138 missions in Vietnam and linebacker in 1972. And it puts you in a tough position because on one hand, you think about it very theoretically, very academically, but I can tell you, as Winston Churchill said, there's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at and missed. And, and fortunately, I was missed. But I had to make a decision, and when the first time you get shot at, it's a very interesting experience. How do you react? Are you able to do your job, or do you somehow freeze? So fortunately, I was able to do my job, and I was one of the lucky ones that came back with all my parts and pieces, and that military experience led me eventually to the space shuttle program. But I wanted to share just one thing, or two things actually. The first one was, I guess I had the most ignominious experience to be the last Air Force ROTC student detachment commander here. That's when it was taken off campus in the spring of 1969, so that was my tour of duty. But I will say that it was also a little tough walking around campus in your uniform. However, fortunate, some of us lived in Littlefield, and the Air Force ROTC was in the bottom of Sales Hall, so it was a pretty short sprint to be able to get over there without being accosted too much. But when I got back from Vietnam, it was really kind of tough, and I went back to graduate school, thought about becoming a doctor, a medical doctor, and so I applied to medical school, was interviewed at NYU for a medical school position. And this young doctor that was interviewing me, just about my age, really, he was probably 26, just out of medical school. And we were going through my background and experience, and I just finished my master's degree in engineering at MIT, so I had all the coursework. And he looked at me, and he goes, so you want to be a doctor? Why do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to assuage your guilt for killing babies and children in the war? And I said to myself, this is either a test or I'm going to go across the table and choke him. So needless to say, I didn't get into NYU. But the last thing I'd like to say really is that, you know, the way we took care of our people, we tried to do the best we could. We were doing a job for our country. We were not the decision makers. We were not the policy makers. And it's really important that we take care of our veterans. I think the way a lot of veterans were treated coming back from that war, and even till today in terms of veterans administration and programs, I think we really need to address this issue. We ask so much of our young people, and it's only fair that we as a country give them their due and support them when they come back. So that would be the aspect that I would ask you for today. Thank you very much.